The next morning, Rose awoke to the soft light filtering through the curtains of her room at the Shadow Realm bar. For a moment, she lay still, allowing herself to soak in the peaceful quiet, so different from the chaos and turmoil that had marked her recent past. As she sat up, she noticed a neatly folded pile of clothes on the chair beside her bed. Curious, she moved closer to inspect them. It was a dress, elegant in its simplicity. The fabric was soft and fluid, a deep, rich blue that seemed to shimmer subtly as it caught the light. Beside it lay a pair of shoes, delicate flats that matched the dress perfectly. Rose felt a sudden lump in her throat. Silas. He must have laid these out for her while she slept, a quiet gesture of care and understanding. She dressed slowly, marveling at the feel of the fabric against her skin. It had been so long since she'd worn anything so fine, so far removed from the practical armor and rough-spun tunics of her life as a warrior. When she emerged from her room, she found Silas waiting for her. He was seated at a table in the quiet corner of the bar, two steaming mugs before him. When he saw her, his face lit up with a warm smile. "Good morning," he said as she approached. "I hope you slept well." Rose nodded, settling into the chair opposite him. "Better than I have in a very long time," she admitted. "Thank you, Silas, for everything." He waved a hand dismissively. "It's the least I could do." He pushed one of the mugs towards her. "Tea. I remember you used to like it strong." Rose wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "You remember a lot of things, it seems." Silas's smile turned slightly wistful. "I remember everything about you, Rose. You are important to me." There was a moment of comfortable silence as they sipped their tea. Then Silas leaned forward, his expression turning more serious. "Rose," he said gently, "I know you've been through a lot, and I want you to know that you're safe here, for as long as you need. But there are some things you should know about this place." Rose set down her mug, giving him her full attention. "The Shadow Realm bar," she said. "I remember you talking about it all those years ago. Your dream." Silas nodded. "It's more than a dream now. It's a reality. But it's a reality that comes with certain rules." He began to explain, his voice low and steady. He told her about the dual nature of the bar, the human side and the Shadow Realm side. He described the types of patrons that frequented each side, the delicate balance that had to be maintained. "The most important rule," he said, "is no violence. This is a neutral ground, a place where all are welcome, provided they abide by the truce. The bouncer, Grim, he enforces this, rigorously." Rose nodded slowly, absorbing the information. It made sense. A place like this, where the supernatural and the mundane mingled, it would require strict governance. "I understand," she said. "And I'll respect the rules, of course. I don't want any more fighting, Silas. I'm tired of it." Silas reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. "I know, Rose. And you don't have to fight, not here. This can be your sanctuary for as long as you need it to be." Rose felt a sudden welling of emotion. Gratitude, relief, and something else, something warm and tender that she wasn't quite ready to name. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice slightly hoarse. "Thank you for giving me a place to find myself again." Silas squeezed her hand gently. "You've always known who you are, Rose. You just need to remember it, and I'll be here to help you every step of the way." And there, in the quiet sanctuary of the Shadow Realm bar, with the promise of a new beginning stretching before her, Rose felt the first stirrings of hope. Rose followed Silas as he led her through the streets of Traverse City, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of history. The city was a fascinating blend of the modern and the mystical, with sleek buildings standing alongside ancient moss-covered stones that seemed to hum with latent energy. As they walked, Rose found herself marveling at the ease with which Silas navigated this world. He greeted passers-by with warm familiarity, his manner effortlessly shifting between the casual charm he used with humans and the more guarded respect he showed to those Rose suspected were supernatural. Eventually, they came to a stop in front of a dilapidated brownstone. The building had clearly seen better days with boarded-up windows and a front door that hung slightly off its hinges. But there was something about it, a faint aura of magic that Rose could feel prickling at the edges of her senses. "This," Silas said, "is the brownstone." Rose raised an eyebrow. "It's charming," she said diplomatically. Silas chuckled. "It's a wreck," he agreed, "but it's a wreck with potential. Come on, I'll show you." No. He led her up the creaking steps and through the front door. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty scent of neglect. But as they moved further into the house, Rose began to see what Silas meant. Beneath the grime and the cobwebs, the bones of the house were strong. The floors, though scuffed and stained, were made of sturdy hardwood. The walls, when Rose brushed away the dust, revealed intricate mouldings and carvings. And then there was the magic. It was faint, almost dormant, but Rose could feel it thrumming through the very foundations of the house, wards ancient and powerful, layered into the structure itself. "I acquired this place through a deal at the Shadow Realm Bar," Silas explained as they explored. "It used to belong to a powerful witch long ago. She wove protections into every brick and beam." Rose ran her hand along a wall, feeling the faint pulse of energy beneath her fingertips. "It's incredible," she murmured. Silas watched her, a small smile playing about his lips. "It's yours if you want it," he said quietly. Rose turned to him, startled. "What?" "The house," Silas said. "It's yours, if you want it. I don't use it, and frankly, it's wasted on me, but you— Rose, you could make this place sing again." Rose stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. A home. A real home, not just a temporary refuge or a place to lay her head between battles. The idea was almost overwhelming. "Silas, I don't know what to say." He held up a hand. "You don't have to say anything. Just think about it. The house needs work, I know. The wards need updating, and the whole thing needs to be repaired and cleaned. But more than that, it needs to be loved. And I think you're just the person to do that." Rose felt a lump in her throat. The generosity of the offer, the implicit trust and care in it. It was almost too much. But Silas wasn't done. "There's something else," he said, his expression turning more serious. "The Shadow Realm Bar. We could use someone with your skill set." Rose frowned slightly. "My skill set?" "Your ability to read people, to gather information, to navigate the shadows." Silas's gaze was intense. "Rose, you were one of the best information brokers I've ever known, and in a place like the Shadow Realm Bar, where the supernatural and the mundane intersect, those skills are invaluable." Rose felt a flicker of the old excitement, the thrill of the game. It had been so long since she'd used those skills, since she'd let herself be anything other than a warrior. But the idea of stepping back into that world, of opening herself up to the risks and the intrigues, it was daunting. Silas seemed to sense her hesitation. "You don't have to decide now," he said gently, "and there's no obligation. The house is yours regardless, but think about it. You could do a lot of good, Rose, and you could do it on your own terms." On her own terms. The phrase echoed in Rose's mind as they made their way back to the Shadow Realm Bar. Her own terms? When was the last time she'd had that luxury? As she settled into her room that night, her mind buzzing with possibilities, Rose felt a strange mix of emotions: excitement, trepidation, hope. And beneath it all, a growing sense of purpose. She looked around the room at the simple but comfortable furnishings, the warm glow of the lamplight. This wasn't just a place to stay, she realized. This was a place to start over. A place to build something new. And whether that was a home in a rundown brownstone, or a new role as an information broker in the Shadow Realm Bar, Rose knew one thing for certain. She was ready to start building. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Rose found herself settling into a new rhythm of life. Her days were spent at the brownstone, working tirelessly to restore the old house to its former glory. It was hard work, but it was also deeply satisfying. With each repaired floorboard, each polished banister, each room cleared of dust and debris, Rose felt a sense of accomplishment and pride. This was tangible, measurable progress, something she could see and touch, a far cry from the endless, intangible battles she'd fought for so long. And as she worked, she could feel the house itself coming back to life. The dormant magic that had lain sleeping in its bones began to awaken, responding to her presence and her care. The wards, once she'd taken the time to study and reinforce them, thrummed with renewed power. It was almost as if the house was sentient, appreciating and reciprocating the love and attention Rose was pouring into it. Her evenings were spent at the Shadow Realm bar, learning the ropes of her new role as an information broker. Under Silas's guidance, she began to relearn the skills she'd once wielded so adeptly, the art of listening, of observing, of piecing together snippets of conversation and body language into a coherent whole. It was like exercising a muscle she hadn't used in years. At first, it was difficult, even painful. Rose found herself second-guessing her instincts, hesitating where once she would have acted with confidence. But slowly, surely, it started to come back to her. She began to make connections, to build a network of contacts and informants. She learned which patrons to approach directly and which to observe from afar, which bits of information were valuable and which were mere noise. And she began to make a difference. One of her first major successes was preventing a violent clash between a werewolf pack and a vampire coven. Tensions had been simmering between the two groups for months, with each side accusing the other of encroaching on their territory. Through careful listening and a few well-placed questions, Rose was able to piece together the real story. A third party, a group of human developers, was trying to buy up land in both the werewolves' forest and the vampires' historic district. They'd been subtly stoking the tensions between the two groups, hoping to drive down property prices. Armed with this knowledge, Rose was able to bring the leaders of the werewolves and vampires together. In the neutral ground of the Shadow Realm bar, she laid out the evidence she'd gathered, showing them how they'd been manipulated. Faced with this information, the two groups were able to put aside their differences and unite against the real threat. They pooled their resources, bought up the land themselves, and made it clear to the developers that they were not welcome. It was a major victory, not just for the werewolves and vampires, but for Rose herself. She'd prevented bloodshed, yes, but more than that, she'd proven her value. Word began to spread. If you needed information, if you needed help navigating the complex world of the supernatural, Rose was the one to see. As her reputation grew, so too did the respect she commanded. Patrons who had once eyed her with suspicion now greeted her with nods of acknowledgement. Those who had brushed her off now sought her out, eager for her insights. Even Grim, the taciturn bouncer, began to show her a gruff sort of approval. He'd nod to her when she entered, sometimes even going so far as to grunt out a rose in greeting. And through it all, Rose could feel herself changing. The weight of her past, while still present, seemed to grow a little lighter each day. The skills she'd once used for battle were now being used to maintain peace, to help others. She was building something here in this strange new city, a life, a purpose, a home. And as she stood in the brownstone, surveying the work she'd done, the gleaming wood, the vibrant energy, the sense of warmth and welcome, Rose felt a swell of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride, hope, and maybe, just maybe, happiness. It was a new feeling, fragile and tentative, but it was there, growing stronger each day. Rose sat at the bar, sipping her drink and surveying the room. It had been a quiet night at the Shadow Realm, with only a handful of regulars scattered about. She could feel the restlessness stirring within her, that familiar itch for something more, something exciting. Her eyes landed on a man at the end of the bar. He was handsome, in a rugged sort of way, with broad shoulders and a jawline that could cut glass. He was also, undoubtedly, human. Rose felt a smile curve her lips. Perhaps the evening wouldn't be so dull after all. She made her way over to him, her hips swaying with each step. She could feel his eyes on her, taking in her form-fitting dress, her cascading hair, the glint in her eye. "Buy a girl a drink?" she purred as she slid onto the stool next to him. He blinked, clearly taken aback by her forwardness, but then a slow smile spread across his face. "I'd be delighted," he said, signalling the bartender. Over drinks, they fell into easy conversation. His name was Jack, and he was new in town, working as a contractor on a building project downtown. Rose listened attentively, laughing at his jokes, letting her hand brush his arm as she spoke. It was almost too easy. A few well-placed compliments, a few lingering looks, and she could see his pupils dilate, his breathing quicken. When she suggested they get out of there, take a walk in the moonlight, he practically tripped over himself to agree. As they strolled through the quiet streets, Rose could feel the anticipation building. This was the part she loved, the dance, the build-up, the promise of what was to come. When Jack pulled her into a shadowed alcove and pressed his lips to hers, she didn't resist. She melted into the kiss, letting herself get lost in the sensation, in the heat of his body against hers. They ended up back at his place, a sparsely furnished apartment that spoke of a life in transition. But Rose wasn't there for the decor. She was there for the way Jack looked at her like she was the most desirable thing he'd ever seen, for the way his hands felt as they roamed her body, for the way he gasped her name as she took him to heights he'd never known. In the afterglow, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Jack traced patterns on her skin and murmured about how amazing she was, how he'd never met anyone like her. Rose just smiled, enjoying the buzz of satisfaction, the feeling of being wanted, being adored. It wasn't love. It wasn't even a real connection. But it was something. A way to feel alive, to feel in control. A way to forget, just for a little while, the restlessness that gnawed at her insides. Over the next few weeks, there were others. A lawyer she met at the coffee shop, a musician who played at the bar on weekends, a visiting businessman with a smile that promised sin. Each encounter was thrilling in its own way, each man a new adventure. Rose lost herself in the rush of it all, in the power she felt as she brought these men to their knees with a look, a touch, a whispered word. But always, in the quiet moments afterwards, the restlessness would return. The sense that something was missing, that she was meant for more than this. She knew she couldn't keep this up forever, knew that eventually she'd have to face what she was really running from. But for now, it was enough. The thrill of the chase, the heat of the moment, the brief, shining escape from the everyday. Silas watched Rose from across the bar, concern etched into his weathered features. He'd seen her leave with yet another human man, had watched the pattern repeat itself over the past few weeks. At first, he'd tried to tell himself it was none of his business. Rose was a grown woman, more than capable of making her own choices. But as her friend, as someone who cared about her deeply, he couldn't help but worry. He waited until closing time when the last patrons had stumbled out into the night and he and Rose were alone in the quiet of the bar. "Rose," he said softly, catching her eye as she wiped down the counter. "Can we talk?" Something in his tone must have given him away because she stilled, her shoulders tensing slightly. "Of course," she said, setting down her rag. "What's on your mind?" Silas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time with the human patrons lately." Rose arched an eyebrow, a playful smirk tugging at her lips. "Why, Silas, have you been spying on me?" "Observing," he corrected gently. "You taught me well, remember? And as your friend, I feel I need to ask, is everything okay? The smirk faded from Rose's face. She looked down, suddenly very interested in a spot on the counter. Everything's fine, she said, but the words lacked conviction. Silas sighed, moving closer. Rose, I know you. I know you're not the type to seek out meaningless flings. This behavior, it's not like you. Rose's head snapped up, a flash of defensiveness in her eyes. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think you do. Maybe not, Silas conceded. But I do know that you're one of the strongest, most principled people I've ever met. And this feels like you're running from something. Rose was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet Silas had to strain to hear her. I'm restless, Silas, she admitted. I'm bored. I feel like I'm meant for more than this. More than playing information broker. More than restoring an old house. Silas nodded slowly, understanding dawning. And these men, they're a distraction, a way to feel alive. Rose shrugged, but she didn't deny it. They're fun, she said. They're exciting. And when I'm with them, I don't feel so empty. Silas's heart ached at the admission. He reached out, placing a hand on Rose's shoulder. Rose, I understand. More than you know. But this isn't the answer. It won't fill the void, not really. It's just a temporary fix. Rose was quiet, but she didn't shrug off his touch. I know, she said finally. I know it's not healthy. But I don't know what else to do, Silas. I don't know how to make this feeling go away. Silas squeezed her shoulder, trying to convey all the love and support he felt through that simple touch. We'll figure it out, he promised. Together. Just like we always have. But you don't have to do this alone, Rose. You don't have to run anymore. Rose took a shuddering breath, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I don't know how to stop, she admitted. Silas smiled softly. One day at a time, he said. That's all any of us can do, and I'll be here every step of the way. I promise. And there, in the quiet of the Shadow Realm bar, with the weight of Silas's hand on her shoulder and the warmth of his words in her heart, Rose felt something shift. Not a solution, not a cure-all, but a start, a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in her darkest moments, she was not alone. And with that knowledge, that steady support, perhaps she could find her way back to the light. A year had passed since Rose's conversation with Silas, and while things had changed, in many ways they remained the same. Rose had taken Silas's words to heart, recognizing the truth in his gentle admonishment. She had pulled back from her more reckless behavior, no longer seeking solace in the arms of strangers. But the flirtations, the idle chats with handsome human men, those remained. They were a harmless diversion, a way to pass the time and feel a spark of that old thrill. Rose was careful not to let it go too far, not to promise more than she was willing to give. It was a delicate balance, but one she felt she was managing well. Life at the Shadow Realm bar had settled into a comfortable routine. Rose's role as an information broker had become second nature, her network of contacts and informants growing by the day. She and Silas worked side by side, a well-oiled machine, keeping the peace and the secrets of the supernatural world. It was an average day, no different from 100 others. Rose was at her usual spot at the end of the bar, engaged in playful banter with a charming young man who had become a regular over the past few months. Silas was in his office going over the books, the soft scratch of his pen a familiar background noise. Then, the door burst open. One of their regulars, a werewolf named Marcus, came rushing in. His eyes were wide, his face pale beneath his dark beard. He scanned the room frantically until his gaze landed on Rose. "Come with me," he said, his voice tight with urgency. Without waiting for a response, he turned and headed straight for Silas's office. Rose exchanged a glance with her companion, who looked as bewildered as she felt. With a murmured apology, she slid off her stool and followed Marcus, a sense of unease settling in her gut. She found Marcus in Silas's office, pacing in front of the desk. Silas was standing, his brow furrowed in concern. "What's going on?" Rose asked, closing the door behind her. Marcus stopped pacing, turning to face her. "It's Ultranacious Eternus," he said, the name sending a chill down Rose's spine. "He's dead." For a moment the room was silent. Rose could hear the blood rushing in her ears, could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. "What?" she managed finally, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "How?" "He was killed," Marcus said, running a hand through his hair, "by a mortal, a man named Gunnar." Silas sank back into his chair, looking as shocked as Rose felt. "A mortal killed Ultranacious Eternus? How is that possible?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know the details. All I know is what I've heard through the grapevine. Ultranacious is dead, and this Gunnar guy is the one who did it." Rose's mind was reeling. Ultranacious Eternus, the Dark Lord who had haunted her nightmares, the enemy she had fought for so long. Dead. At the hands of a mortal, no less. It seemed impossible. "Are we sure it's true?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "This isn't just some rumour." Marcus met her gaze, his eyes serious. "It's true," he said. "I've confirmed it with multiple sources. Ultranacious is gone." Rose sank into a chair, her legs suddenly feeling weak. She looked at Silas, saw her own shock and disbelief mirrored in his face. "What does this mean?" she asked softly. Silas shook his head, looking as lost as she felt. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I have a feeling our world is about to change." Rose looked down at her hands, at the scars and calluses that marked her as a warrior. She had spent so long fighting Ultranacious, had sacrificed so much to stop him. And now he was gone, just like that, at the hands of a mortal she'd never even heard of. It was a lot to process. But as she sat there, in the quiet of Silas's office, with the weight of this news settling over them, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That whatever came next, whatever this Gunnar's actions had set in motion, it was going to change everything. Rose sat in Silas's office, her mind reeling from the news of Ultranacious Eternus's death. She could feel Silas's eyes on her, could sense his concern, but she couldn't tear her thoughts away from this new development. "Marcus," she said finally, looking up at the werewolf, "what else do you know about this Gunnar? About how he was able to kill Ultranacious?" Marcus shook his head. "Not much, just that he's human and that he's the leader of some group called the Pack." Rose frowned. The Pack? The name wasn't familiar, but something about it tugged at her, like a half-remembered dream. "And the Black Dawn?" she asked, remembering Ultranacious followers. "Were they involved?" Marcus nodded. "From what I've heard, they're the ones who summoned Ultranacious to Earth in the first place. There was some kind of confrontation with the Pack. Several of Gunnar's people were killed." Rose sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The Black Dawn operating on Earth, and Ultranacious drawn into battle with mortals. It was almost too much to comprehend. "I need to know more," she said finally, standing up. "I need to find out everything I can about this Pack, about how a mortal could have taken down Ultranacious." Silas stood as well, his expression concerned. "Rose, be careful. Getting involved in this, it could be dangerous." Rose met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "I have to know Silas. Ultranacious. He was my fight. For so long. I need to understand what happened." Silas sighed, coming around the desk to stand in front of her. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch gentle but firm. "Rose," he said softly, "I understand. Better than anyone I understand. But you've built a life here. A good life. You've found peace. Don't throw that away chasing ghosts from your past." Rose opened her mouth to argue, but Silas continued before she could speak. The Shadow Realm Bar, he said, is the heart of the supernatural community. If there's information to be found about Gunnar and the pack, it will come to us. You don't need to go looking for trouble. Let it come to you. Rose hesitated, torn between her burning need for answers and the wisdom in Silas's words. She looked around the office, at the life she had built here, the home she had made. Could she really risk all of that? Slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said softly. Okay, we'll do it your way. For now. Silas smiled, squeezing her shoulders gently before releasing her. Good. Trust me, Rose. If there's something to know, we'll hear about it. Over the next few weeks, Rose threw herself into her work at the Shadow Realm Bar with renewed intensity. She listened to every conversation, followed up on every whispered rumor, piecing together a picture of the events that had rocked the supernatural world. Slowly, information began to trickle in. Stories of the pack's exploits, of their battles against supernatural threats. Whispers about Gunnar, the mysterious human leader who had somehow managed to kill one of the most powerful beings in existence. But the more Rose learned, the more questions she had. Who was Gunnar, really? What drove him to fight against the supernatural? And how had he and his pack become strong enough to take on the likes of Ultranacious Eternus? She knew she wouldn't find all the answers in the Shadow Realm Bar. But Silas had been right. This was the best place to gather information, to keep her ear to the ground. And so she waited and watched and listened, biding her time until the right moment presented itself. She knew somehow that her path would cross with Gunnar's eventually, that the events set in motion by Ultranacious's death would bring them face to face. And when that day came, Rose would be ready.